Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was forced to fight former heroes for survival. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The evening air was cool, a welcome balm against the lingering warmth of the late spring day. It carried the scent of cherry blossoms from a nearby park and the distant, comforting rumble of Mizutafu's ceaseless urban heart. For Izuku Midoriya, now a pro-hero operating under the name Deku, this was the perfect patrol. Quiet. Peaceful. The kind of night that let a hero feel less like a soldier and more like a guardian. He stood atop a 5-story apartment building, a silhouette against the twilight sky painted in hues of deep violet and burnt orange. His costume, upgraded and reinforced since his school days, felt like a second skin. The full gauntlets on his arms were cool to the touch, and the iron soles of his boots were magnetized just enough to give him a sure footing on the metal ledge. For the past year since graduating from UA, he had worked tirelessly, climbing the ranks with a blend of overwhelming power and an almost reckless empathy that had become his signature. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of settled confidence. One for all hummed beneath his skin, a familiar and potent current of energy. He could hold a stable 45% output for extended periods now, a feat that would have shattered his body to dust only a few years ago. The vestiges within him were a silent, supportive chorus, their presence a constant reassurance. He was in control. He was making a difference. A soft, almost imperceptible prickle ran down the base of his skull. Danger sense. He straightened, his relaxed posture vanishing in an instant. Green lightning crackled around him as he dropped into a low crouch, his eyes scanning the streets below. The sensation wasn't the sharp, agonizing spike of an imminent attack. It was more like a low-grade static, a faint thrum of something wrong that he couldn't quite place. He'd felt it on and off for the last 10 minutes, dismissing it as the general background noise of a city that never truly slept. But this time, it was more focused. Down below, an elderly woman was struggling with 2 overflowing grocery bags. As she fumbled for her keys, one of the paper bags ripped, sending a cascade of oranges tumbling across the sidewalk. Deku smiled. So that was it. A citizen in minor distress. It was hardly a danger, but his quirk had always been overzealous when it came to potential misfortune, no matter how small. In a flicker of green light, he was on the ground. "Ma'am? Let me help you with that." The woman startled, her eyes wide, before recognition softened her expression. "Oh. Goodness me, it's Deku." "You gave an old heart a fright." "Sorry about that," he said, his voice warm and genuine. He quickly gathered the scattered oranges, his movements a fluid blur. A thin, black tendril snaked out from his fingertip, black whip, and deftly wrapped around the torn bag, sealing it shut. He lifted both bags as if they weighed nothing. "Where to?" She pointed a trembling finger at a nearby apartment door. "Just right there, dearie." "Thank you so much." The heroes these days, always so busy with the big monsters. "No problem is too small," he replied, quoting a line he'd heard All Might use countless times. He carried her groceries to her door, waited patiently as she unlocked it, and placed them gently on her kitchen counter. She offered him tea, which he politely declined. As he turned to leave, she placed a wrinkled hand on his arm. "You be careful out there, son. It feels too quiet tonight." Her words resonated with the unease he'd been feeling. "I will. Have a good night, ma'am." He stepped back out into the street. The static from danger sense had faded, but the silence she mentioned now seemed heavy, unnatural. The usual sounds, distant sirens, passing cars, the murmur of nightlife, were conspicuously absent. This district, while residential, was never this dead. It was as if a bubble of silence had descended upon this specific block. His radio crackled. "Deku, this is Central Dispatch. We're getting an anonymous report of a possible gas leak on your patrol route. Corner of 4th and Sakura. Can you confirm?" "On my way," he replied, his body already coiling with energy. A gas leak was a civilian threat. His priority. He launched himself into the air, the wind whipping past his ears. The feeling of wrongness intensified, danger sense now a persistent, insistent hum. He landed softly on the designated street corner. The air was still. There was no smell of gas. No hissing pipes. Nothing. Just an eerie quiet. A trap. The realization hit him a microsecond before danger sense erupted into a full-blown scream of agony inside his head. It was a piercing, ice-cold spike of pure terror, warning of a multifaceted, immediate threat from all directions. HSSSSSSSS. The sound came from everywhere at once. Small, metallic canisters, previously hidden in the shadows of doorways and alleyways, simultaneously released thick plumes of pale yellow gas. It didn't rise. It clung to the ground, a dense, rolling fog that smelled faintly of ozone and bitter almonds. Quirk-suppressing gas. He held his breath, a desperate, instinctive act. He fired one for all at 50%, aiming to blast himself clear of the rapidly expanding cloud. But his body felt sluggish, his limbs heavy as lead. The crackle of green lightning around him sputtered and died. The immense power that was always at his command flickered like a dying candle in a hurricane. The gas wasn't just in the air. It was a nanomist, designed for rapid absorption through the skin. He felt a tingling numbness spread from his hands and feet inward. The connection to One for All, that vibrant river of energy, was being dammed. He could feel the vestiges, not as a chorus, but as distant, panic shouts across a widening chasm. He staggered, his vision blurring at the edges. His lungs burned, demanding air. He had to get out. He forced his legs to move, each step a monumental effort. Then, the figures emerged from the fog. There were 4 of them, clad in matte black tactical gear that absorbed the light. They wore full-face helmets with opaque visors, rendering them anonymous and inhuman. They moved with a chilling, synchronized efficiency that spoke of countless hours of training. They didn't have flashy quirks. They didn't need them. One of them fired a grappling hook that wrapped around his ankle. He tried to power through it, but his strength was deserting him. It felt like he was back in his own powerless body, a frail boy fighting against hardened steel. They yanked, and he crashed to the ground, his head smacking hard against the pavement. Another figure stood over him, holding a device that looked like a modified riot baton. A low hum emanated from it. Before Deku could react, the figure jabbed it into his side. It wasn't an electric shock. It was a wave of pure, debilitating nausea and disorientation. His senses spun out of control. The world tilted on its axis, and the last reserves of his strength evaporated. He tried to summon Black Whip, a desperate, final attempt. He could feel the tendrils trying to form, but they were weak, ephemeral things, dissolving into black smoke before they could even take shape. One of the figures knelt beside him. Deku stared up, his vision swimming. He couldn't see a face, only his own terrified reflection in the dark visor. The figure raised a gloved hand and pressed a syringe against his neck. A sharp, cold sting, and then, nothing. A profound, terrifying blackness swallowed him whole. His last conscious thought was not of the villains or the fight, but of the old woman's groceries on her counter. A tiny beacon of normalcy in a world that had just been stolen from him. Waking was a slow, agonizing process. It began not with sight or sound, but with a feeling, cold. A deep, biting cold that seemed to radiate from the very surface he was lying on. It seeped through the fabric of his costume, and into his bones. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a grim counterpoint to the frantic beating of his heart. A metallic, chemical taste coated his tongue. He groaned, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the space he was in. He forced his eyes open. Gray. Everything was a uniform, featureless gray. He was lying on a floor of smooth, polished concrete. He pushed himself up, his muscles protesting. The nausea from the weapon was gone, but a profound weakness remained. He looked around, his hero instincts kicking in despite his disorientation. The room was a perfect cube, perhaps 20 feet on each side. The walls, floor, and ceiling were all made of the same seamless, gray concrete. There were no windows, no vents, no furniture, and most unnervingly, no visible door. In the exact center of the ceiling, a single, flat panel glowed with a harsh, sterile white light that cast no shadows. He was in a box. A tomb. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up his throat. He forced it down, his breath hitching. Assess. Analyze. Act. The mantra of his mentor, Sir Night Eye, echoed in his mind. He stood up, swaying for a moment. He checked himself over. His costume was intact, but his utility belt was gone. His gauntlets and iron saws were still on, but they felt inert, their internal mechanisms deactivated. He reached for his face. His mask was still in place, but his comms unit had been ripped out, leaving behind a few frayed wires. He was alone. Disconnected. Unarmed. He took a deep breath and reached inward, searching for the familiar warmth of One for All. It was there. The dam had been removed, and the river was flowing again. The connection felt sluggish, muted, like he was trying to shout through a thick pane of glass, but it was there. The vestiges were present, their collective consciousness a low, worried murmur in the back of his mind. He wasn't at full strength, but he wasn't powerless. He walked to one of the walls, pressing his palm against it. It was cold and utterly solid. He knocked on it. The sound was a dull, dense thud. No echo. No vibration. He tried to activate One for All, channeling a mere 5% into his fist. The green lightning that flickered around his arm seemed dimmer than usual. He struck the wall. The impact jarred his entire arm, sending a painful shockwave up to his shoulder. It didn't leave so much as a scratch. The wall was either incredibly thick or reinforced with something designed to absorb kinetic energy. He was a prisoner. But who were his captors? The League of Villains? Their methods were usually more chaotic, more theatrical. This was cold, precise, and technological. A new organization? The thought sent a chill down his spine. A new, well-funded, and highly capable enemy was the last thing the already fragile hero's society needed. As if summoned by his thoughts, a voice filled the room. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, a disembodied sound projected with perfect clarity. It was male, smooth, and laced with an unnerving, academic condescension. It was the voice of a man who had never been told no in his life and was utterly convinced of his own brilliance. Greetings, pro-hero Deku. Or perhaps, Izuku Midoriya. I do hope your accommodations, though Spartan, are acceptable. We took great care to ensure the integrity of the structure. Deku spun around, searching for a speaker, a hidden camera, anything. He found nothing. Who are you? What do you want? He yelled, his voice sounding small in the stark room. Who I am is irrelevant, the voice replied, a hint of amusement in its tone. You may call me the conductor. As for what I want to witness a masterpiece. I want to hear a symphony of true strength. And you, young man, have been selected to be my first violinist. The conductor's words were drenched in a theatricality that made Deku's skin crawl. I don't understand. Is this some kind of game? A game? The voice chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. No. A game has winners and losers. This is a crucible. A grand experiment. You see, Mr. Midoriya, I have a hypothesis. Our modern hero society, with its rankings, its media spectacles, and its emphasis on public approval, has grown decadent. It breeds peacocks, not eagles. It creates celebrities, not saviors. It has become a gilded cage that stifles true potential. Deku's fists clenched. You're wrong. Heroes save people. They risk their lives every single day to maintain the status quo. The conductor's voice cut in, losing its smooth edge for a fraction of a second, revealing a sliver of fervent passion beneath. They fight to patch the holes in a sinking ship, celebrating their own mediocrity. True strength, the kind of strength that changes the world, is not forged in the public eye. It is forged in the furnace of absolute necessity. In the crucible of life or death combat, where there are no cameras, no adoring fans, and no rules but one, survive. A section of the wall in front of Deku began to glow. A faint line appeared, tracing the shape of a large door. With a low hum of powerful machinery, the entire section slid silently sideways, revealing not freedom, but a new, horrifying vista. And that, Izuku Midoriya, the conductor declared, his voice swelling with dramatic flair, is why you are here. You possess a power of unprecedented potential. One for all. A beautiful, terrible instrument, but you have been taught to play it with a child's restraint. You hold back. You prioritize the safety of your enemies. You fight not to win but to save. A noble, but ultimately flawed, ideology. Deku stared out of the opening, his heart sinking into a pit of ice. He was looking out onto a city, or what was left of one. Ruined skyscrapers clawed at a sickly, sulfur-yellow sky. Shattered streets were littered with the rusted hulks of cars and buses. Nature was already reclaiming the space, with thick vines strangling concrete pillars and weeds bursting through cracked pavement. It was a scene of utter desolation, stretching as far as the eye could see. He recognized some of the architecture. It was the Gunga Mountain Villa area, the former stronghold of the Paranormal Liberation Front, now a quarantined ruin. "Welcome to the stage," the conductor's voice purred. "Your arena. The rules of the hero's crucible are elegantly simple. You will be faced with a series of opponents. To proceed, you must outperform them, defeat them, incapacitate them. The method is yours to choose. Your only objective is to be the one left standing. Your progress, your biometrics, your quirk output, everything will be monitored and analyzed. You are a data point in the most important research project ever conceived." "You're insane," Deku whispered, the words barely audible. "History is written by the insane who succeed," the conductor retorted. "Now, the overture is about to begin. I suggest you step outside. Your first opponent is waiting." The wall behind Deku began to slide shut, slowly pushing him forward. He had no choice. He stepped out of the concrete room and onto the cracked asphalt of the dead city. The wall sealed behind him with a final, booming thud that echoed the closing of a coffin lid. The air in the arena was stale and carried the scent of dust, decay, and damp earth. Above, the yellow sky was not a sky at all. It was a barrier, a shimmering, translucent dome of energy that trapped him within this urban graveyard. He could see small, dark shapes zipping through the artificial sky, drones, dozens of them, their red optical sensors like the eyes of predatory birds. He was being watched from every angle. He felt a familiar prickle at the base of his skull, but this time it wasn't a gentle hum. Danger sense was screaming. It wasn't a single, directional spike, but a chaotic, overwhelming cacophony. The entire arena was a threat. The barrier, the drones, the very ground he stood on felt hostile. It was a disorienting, nauseating flood of information that made it impossible to pinpoint any specific, immediate danger. It was like trying to hear a whisper in the middle of a rock concert. He had to get his bearings. He had to find a defensible position. He channeled one for all, the green lightning now a more confident crackle around him. The open air, however desolate, felt less constricting than the box. He leaped onto the roof of a nearby overturned bus, his iron saws clinging to the rusted metal. From this slightly elevated position, he could see more of the landscape. It was a labyrinth of urban decay. Broken buildings created jagged canyons. Collapsed overpasses formed makeshift bridges and tunnels. It was a perfect environment for ambushes and guerrilla tactics. He needed to find high ground, a proper vantage point. He spotted the skeletal remains of a skyscraper about half a mile away, its top floors shattered and open to the elements. It would be a treacherous climb, but it would give him the lay of the land. He began to move, a green blur flitting through the ruins. He moved with a practiced, cautious grace, keeping to the shadows, his footfalls silent. Every snapped twig, every gust of wind rustling through a broken window, sent a fresh jolt of useless panic through danger sense. The quirk was becoming a liability, a constant, shrieking alarm with no off switch. He tried to focus, to filter the background noise and search for a specific, directional threat, just as the sixth user, N, had taught him. Focus on the intent, N's voice seemed to whisper in his mind. Not the danger. The will behind it. He closed his eyes for a second, standing in the shadow of a crumbling wall. He filtered out the ambient threat of the drones and the barrier. He focused on the possibility of a living, breathing opponent. There, a single, sharp, directional spike cut through the static. It was faint but clear. Northeast. About 300 yards away, hidden behind the husk of a multi-story car park. The intent it projected wasn't the roaring bloodlust he'd felt from villains like Muscular. It was cold. Blank. An empty, programmed impulse. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. His first opponent. He moved towards the signal, every sense on high alert. He used the debris for cover, weaving through a maze of rusted cars and fallen concrete slabs. The silence was the worst part. It was a loaded silence, pregnant with violence. He reached the edge of the car park. The structure was a skeleton of concrete and rebar, its walls having long since collapsed. He peered around the corner of a massive support pillar. A figure stood in the center of an open plaza, about 50 feet away. They were standing perfectly still, their back to him. Deku recognized the costume immediately, and a wave of dizzying, contradictory emotions washed over him. Relief. Confusion. 3. It was the distinctive blue and white uniform of the normal hero, Manuel. The hero who had in turn Tenya Ida. A kind, respectable, by-the-book hero whose water quirk was primarily used for rescue and civilian support. Another hero. Is he a prisoner too? Manuel-san! Deku called out, his voice echoing slightly in the plaza. The figure did not react. He remained unnervingly still, a statue in the desolate landscape. Manuel-san, it's me, Deku. Are you okay? I was captured too. We have to find a way out of here. He took a cautious step forward, then another. Something was deeply wrong. Manuel's posture was rigid, unnatural. There was a stiffness to his limbs that was completely at odds with the fluid grace of a pro-hero. Deku moved to circle around him, keeping his distance. As he came around to the front, the ice in his gut solidified into a block of pure horror. Manuel's face was slack, his expression utterly vacant. His eyes, normally warm and focused, were wide and glassy, staring at nothing. They were the eyes of a doll, and around his neck, fitted flush against the skin just above his collarbone, was a collar. It was made of a dull, gray metal, seamless and thick. In the center, a single crimson light blinked with a slow, steady pulse, like a malevolent heartbeat. This wasn't a fellow prisoner. This was a puppet. As if on cue, the conductor's voice boomed through the arena, amplified by the unseen speakers on the drones. Ah, the first meeting. Poignant, is it not? A student of the great All Might facing a stalwart, if unremarkable, public servant. A fascinating juxtaposition of potential versus pedestrianism. The voice was filled with a clinical, detached curiosity, like a biologist observing two insects about to fight to the death. Contestant Deku, meet your first trial. Do not bother with pleasantries. He cannot hear you. His higher brain functions are temporarily suppressed. All that remains is his quirk and years of muscle memory, all directed by a singular, elegant command. Deku stared at the collar, his mind racing. Brainwashing? A support item? A mind control quirk? Let us see how you handle this, Mr. Midoriya. The conductor's voice continued, dripping with anticipation. Let us see if your compassionate soul can withstand the onslaught of a fellow hero who has been ordered to kill you. The red light on Manuel's collar flashed once, brightly. Let the first movement of our overture begin. The change was instantaneous. Manuel's body, previously rigid, snapped into a fluid combat stance. The nozzles on his fingertips, once used for gentle streams to guide civilians, now pointed directly at Deku. There was no hesitation. No flicker of recognition. Only the cold, terrifying execution of a command. With a sound like a high-pressure hose, 2 pencil-thin jets of water shot from Manuel's fingers. They weren't the gentle streams Deku had seen on TV. They were compressed to an impossible degree, moving so fast they were practically invisible, leaving shimmering trails in the dusty air. They weren't meant to push or restrain. They were meant to pierce. Deku reacted on pure, unadulterated instinct. Smash! He didn't even have time to call out the name of his move. He dropped his power to 20% and slammed his foot into the ground. The asphalt cracked and shattered, the force of the impact throwing him backwards just as the water jets sliced through the air where his chest had been a millisecond before. They struck the concrete pillar behind him, punching clean through the reinforced concrete with 2 sharp, cracking sounds. He landed in a crouch 20 feet away, his heart feeling like it was trying to beat its way out of his ribcage. He stared at the 2 perfectly round, smoking holes in the pillar. If that had been him, he looked back at Manuel. The hero was already adjusting his aim, his movements economical and precise. This wasn't a fight against a person. It was a fight against a weapon that happened to be wearing a hero's face. The conductor's taunting words echoed in his mind. Let us see if your compassionate soul can withstand the onslaught. Deku's mind, his very soul, was screaming a single, desperate command, save him, but his body, honed by years of brutal training and the instincts of 9 generations of heroes, was screaming something else entirely. Survive. The 2 impulses tore him in half. And as Manuel raised his hands to fire again, Deku realized with chilling certainty that, in the hero's crucible, those 2 commands might be mutually exclusive. The overture had begun, and he was already drenched in the cold sweat of impossible choices. The twin shrieks of compressed water cutting through concrete were the only sounds in the dead city. They were followed by a deafening silence that pressed in on Izuku Midoriya, a physical weight on his shoulders. He was crouched on shattered asphalt, his breath catching in his throat, his gaze fixed on the 2 perfectly round holes drilled through the massive support pillar. They were a grim testament to the lethal force he now faced. Steam hissed from the edges of the holes, the concrete superheated by the sheer velocity of the water. This wasn't Manuel's quirk as the world knew it. This was a perversion, a weaponization of a power meant for life-saving. The man who once used gentle currents to rescue people from floods was now trying to turn him into little more than a red mist. He looked back at Manuel. The hero hadn't moved from his spot, but his arms were tracking Deku's new position with a chilling, robotic smoothness. The vacant look in his eyes was the most terrifying part. There was no anger, no malice, no conflict. There was nothing. It was like fighting a high-performance automaton that wore the skin of a man he respected. An impressive opening dodge, contestant. The conductor's voice echoed from the silent, watchful drones above, a layer of smug satisfaction coating every word. Your reflexes are, as predicted, superb. But reflexes are a base instinct. Let's see if your strategy can evolve beyond simple flight. Strategy. Deku's mind, a frantic whirlwind of terror and disbelief, latched onto the word. He needed a plan. His first instinct, the core of his being, screamed at him, don't hurt him. Restrain him. Wake him up. He could do that. He had the tools. Black Whip was perfect for capture, not harm. He could disarm him, incapacitate him, and then figure out how to deal with that monstrous collar. Manuel-san! He yelled, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the tremor in his hands. Please fight it. I know you're in there. I'm not your enemy. There was no response. Only the cold, unwavering aim of the nozzles on Manuel's fingertips. The conductor let out a theatrical sigh, the sound grating on Deku's nerves. Such pointless sentiment. You are speaking to an empty vessel, Mr. Midoriya. The man you knew is not home. You are wasting your breath and, more importantly, my time. 2 more jets of water erupted from Manuel's hands. This time, Deku was ready. He activated one for all at 30%, green lightning flaring to life around him. He didn't just dodge. He moved with purpose. Using a controlled burst from Fa Gene, he launched himself into a spiraling leap, the twin jets passing harmlessly underneath him. Mid-air, he twisted his body, extending his right arm. Black Whip! Dark, sinewy tendrils of energy erupted from his arm. They weren't the massive, building-smashing constructs he could summon at full power, but smaller, faster whips. He aimed not for Manuel's body, but for his arms, hoping to ensnare his hands and stop the attacks at their source. The tendrils shot forward, but Manuel's reaction was inhumanly fast. He didn't dodge. He simply redirected his water jets, not at Deku, but at the incoming Black Whip tendrils. The compressed water acted like a blade, slicing cleanly through the dark energy. The whips dissolved into harmless black motes before they were even halfway to their target. Deku landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact. He stared in disbelief. Manuel had used his quirk as a close-range defensive measure, something he had never been known to do. His combat data was being used, but without any of the human limitations or heroic protocols that normally governed it. He was fighting Manuel's quirk at its absolute peak efficiency, guided by a cold, tactical AI. A clever attempt, the conductor noted, his voice like that of a professor grading a student's paper. Using your ancillary quirks for non-lethal subjugation. Very much in character, but you fail to appreciate the purity of the instrument you face. Without the hesitation born of morality, Manuel's quirk is a far more versatile tool than you ever imagined. Manuel's stance shifted. He brought his hands together, palms facing each other. The nozzles on all 10 of his fingertips began to glow with a faint blue light. Deku's danger sense, which had been a constant, agonizing static, suddenly spiked with a new, focused intensity. This was something different. Something bigger. Instead of jets, a solid, thick sheet of water erupted from Manuel's hands, fanning out like a liquid wall. It surged across the plaza, not as a wave, but as a battering ram. It churned up dust and debris, moving with terrifying speed. Deku had nowhere to go but up. He channeled power into his legs and leaped, clearing the water wall by a dozen feet, landing on the second-story ledge of a ruined office building. He looked down. The water wasn't receding. Manuel was creating a continuous, high-pressure barrier, effectively splitting the plaza in two. He was controlling the battlefield. He's hurting me, Deku realized with a jolt of cold fear. Manuel swept the water wall to the left, forcing Deku to scramble further along the ledge. The water slammed into the building's facade, pulverizing weathered concrete and shattering the remaining windows. Shards of glass rained down around him. He was being pushed towards the edge of the plaza, towards a narrow alleyway between two crumbling apartment blocks. Do you see it now, contestant? The conductor's voice was laced with the excitement of a lecturer whose students were finally grasping a difficult concept. Heroism, in your world, is reactive. You wait for disaster, and you clean it up. But in a true contest of strength, one must be proactive. One must shape the environment, bend it to one's will. Your opponent understands this. Do you? Deku gritted his teeth. He couldn't let himself be cornered. He needed to break the pattern. As Manuel swept the water wall back towards him, Deku didn't retreat. He ran towards it. He activated Float, the quirk of Nana Shimura, lifting himself a few inches off the ledge to avoid losing his footing on the debris. He charged forward, green lightning trailing behind him. Just as the wall of water was about to slam into him, he leaped. He sailed over the liquid rampart, the spray misting against his costume. He was in the air, exposed, but he was on the offensive. He fired Black Whip again, this time a dozen tendrils at once, creating a wide net aimed to ensnare Manuel's entire body. But the machine was faster. Manuel's water wall collapsed instantly, the liquid splashing uselessly onto the ground. The single-minded program controlling him had calculated that the wall was no longer the optimal strategy. As Deku's Black Whip net descended, Manuel dropped to one knee, and the nozzles on his back, ones rarely used except for propulsion in water, unleashed a torrent, blasting the ground. The plaza floor was now covered in a thin, treacherous sheet of water, and then he fired upwards. Not a jet, but a wide, conical blast of atomized mist. It wasn't an attack. It was a smokescreen. Deku's net hit the ground where Manuel had been a second before. He landed in the center of the newly formed mist cloud, his visibility dropping to near zero. The ground beneath his feet was slick and treacherous. Danger sense screamed. Left. He threw himself to the right, slipping on the wet concrete. A water jet, nearly invisible in the mist, sliced through the space his head had occupied. He scrambled back, his heart pounding. He couldn't see. He was blind, off balance, and his most reliable warning system was being drowned out by the constant, low-level threat of the slick ground. He activated Smokescreen. It was a desperate move, fighting mist with smoke, but his own quirk was something he could control. Thick, black smoke poured from his body, mingling with the white mist. It didn't improve his vision, but it would hopefully obscure Manuel's as well, leveling the playing field. Fighting obscurity with more obscurity? An interesting, if chaotic, choice, the conductor mused. Deku ignored him. He crouched low, straining his ears, trying to hear footsteps, the whisper of moving cloth, anything. He could only hear the frantic thumping of his own blood and the distant, mocking hum of the drones. He felt a subtle shift in the air to his right. He spun, firing a Black Whip tendril defensively. It met nothing but smoke. It was a feint. Danger sense shrieked. Behind! Above! He looked up. A dark shape was descending through the swirling smoke and mist. Manuel had used a burst of water from his feet to propel himself into the air, and now he was coming down, his fingers aimed directly at Deku's head. There was no time to dodge. No time to evade. There was only time to act. He brought his arms up in a crossguard, channeling 45% of one for all into his full gauntlets, the metal groaning under the strain. He braced for the impact of the water jets, but the jets never came. Manuel's objective had changed. He wasn't trying to pierce him anymore. As he fell, he unleashed a massive, wide burst of water directly downwards. It wasn't a weapon, it was a bludgeon. 100 tons of liquid force slammed into Deku, driving him down into the concrete. The impact was cataclysmic. It wasn't sharp, like a punch, but a crushing, overwhelming weight that stole his breath and hammered him into the ground. The asphalt beneath him cracked and buckled. For a moment he felt like he was at the bottom of the deepest ocean trench, the pressure threatening to implode his very bones. His vision went white with pain, and the roar of the water filled his ears. The torrent lasted only a second, but it was enough. He was left lying in a shallow crater, soaked to the bone, his entire body screaming in protest. The air had been forced from his lungs, and he gasped, his chest aching. He had underestimated the sheer blunt force Manuel could generate. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, coughing up water. His head was spinning. Through the thinning mist, he saw Manuel land gracefully a few yards away. The hero stood over him, his hand raised, water already gathering at his fingertips for the finishing blow. This is it, Deku thought, a wave of cold despair washing over him. I held back. I tried to save him. And now I'm going to die. He thought of All Might, his smile strained but hopeful. He thought of his mother, waiting for him to come home. He thought of his friends, of Uraraka, of Ada, of Bakugo. He had failed them. He had failed everyone. He had let his ideals become a suicide pact. The conductor's voice returned, low and disappointed. And so, the first movement ends on a somber note. A predictable tragedy. You had the power to end this from the very first moment, but you chose sentiment. You chose weakness. A pity. I had such high hopes for. No. The word was a spark in the darkness of his mind. It wasn't his own thought. It was a feeling, a shared consensus from the vestiges within One for All. It was the fierce, defiant cry of Nana Shimura. It was the cold, pragmatic logic of the second user. It was the quiet, enduring strength of Yoichi. You will not die here. Survival is the prerequisite for salvation. Show him. Show this monster what true strength is. Their voices, their wills, flooded into him, clearing the fog of pain and despair. They weren't just watching, they were supporting him, lending him their resolve. His vision cleared. The world snapped back into sharp focus. He looked at Manuel, poised to deliver the kill shot. He saw the empty eyes, the metallic collar, the hero trapped inside the puppet. He looked at the ruined city around him, a monument to a villain's victory. He thought of the conductor, watching from his unseen perch, enjoying this grotesque theater, and he made a choice. It was an agonizing choice, a decision that felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. He was a hero. His purpose was to save people, even his enemies. But Manuel wasn't his enemy. He was a victim, and to save the victim, to have any hope of freeing him and surviving to fight the real villain, he had to stop the puppet. Forcefully. The compassion in his heart didn't vanish. It was channeled, focused into a single, terrible resolution. I'm sorry, Manuel-san. Forgive me. As Manuel's fingers began to glow, Deku moved. He didn't get up. He was still on one knee. But his right hand, which had been pressed against the wet ground, shot forward. This wasn't a punch. His fingers were splayed, his palm open. Green lightning, brighter and more intense than before, erupted around his arm. He wasn't drawing on the explosive power of a smash. He was focusing the energy into a different quirk, a different technique. The second user's quirk, Gearshift, flared to life. He applied its effect not to an external object, but to the very air in front of his hand, layering it with a touch of Jin's kinetic energy. Delaware Smash, he flicked his middle finger. It was a controlled, precise movement. He was only using 20% of One for All's raw power, but he amplified the effect with his other quirks. He wasn't aiming at Manuel. He was aiming at the ground directly in front of him. The result was not an explosion. It was a contained, directional shockwave. A cannon blast of air, visible as a ripple in the atmosphere, erupted from his fingertips. It struck the thin layer of water covering the plaza floor. The water, an incompressible fluid, transferred the kinetic energy perfectly. It was like striking the surface of a drum. The entire sheet of water exploded upwards in a violent, concussive wave. Manuel was standing in the middle of it. The blast of water and air hit him from below with the force of a freight train. It wasn't a piercing attack, it was a hammer blow to his entire body. It threw him off his feet, sending him cartwheeling backward through the air. His concentration, maintained by the cold logic of the collar's program, shattered. The water gathering at his fingertips dissipated into harmless vapor. He landed in a heap 15 feet away, skidding across the damp concrete before coming to a stop. He didn't move. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the dripping of water from the surrounding buildings and the ragged gasps of Deku's own breathing. He had won. The realization brought no triumph. No relief. Only a profound, soul-crushing hollowness. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. His body ached, a deep, bruising pain from the water pressure attack. But it was nothing compared to the agony in his heart. His right hand, the one that had delivered the blow, trembled uncontrollably. It felt alien, like it belonged to someone else. It was the hand that had saved so many, but now it had been used to strike down a fellow hero. It was an unwilling fist. The conductor's voice cut through the silence, and this time, it was filled with genuine, manic delight. Yes. Magnificent. Do you feel it, contestant? The sublime power of necessity. You have finally cast aside your childish sentiment and embraced the logic of survival. That, right there, was not the act of a savior. It was the act of a warrior. A perfect, beautiful note in our grand composition. Bravo! Bravo! The praise felt like acid being poured onto a fresh wound. Deku barely heard it. His eyes were locked on Manuel's still form. He staggered forward, his legs unsteady. Every step was an effort. He collapsed to his knees beside the fallen hero, his trembling hands reaching out. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gently rolled Manuel onto his back. The hero's face was still slack, but his eyes were closed now. He was unconscious. Deku's fingers, shaking so badly he could barely control them, found the pulse point on Manuel's neck, just below the jawline. He felt a beat. Faint, but steady. He pressed his ear to Manuel's chest, ignoring the cold, damp fabric of his costume. He heard the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of breathing. He was alive. A wave of relief so powerful it was nauseating washed over Deku. He slumped forward, his forehead resting on the ground next to Manuel's shoulder, and squeezed his eyes shut. Tears of guilt, relief, and self-loathing welled up, mixing with the grime and water on his face. He had done it. He had survived. But at what cost? He had crossed the line he swore he would never cross. He had raised his fist against the hero, a good man, and violently struck him down. It didn't matter that it was to save his own life. It didn't matter that Manuel was being controlled. The act itself was a deep, spiritual wound that he knew would never fully heal. He pushed himself back up, his gaze falling on the collar. Now that he was closer, he could see it more clearly. The metal was a strange, non-reflective alloy. There were no seams, no clasps, no visible power source. It seemed fused directly to the skin. The single red light in the center had stopped its rhythmic pulsing. Now, it was blinking a slow, irregular pattern, like a machine reporting an error code. He gently touched the metal. It was cold, inert. He tried to find a latch or a release mechanism, but there was nothing. It was a solid, immovable ring. His mind, now free from the immediate threat of death, started to analyze. The technology was far beyond anything he'd ever seen. It could suppress a person's consciousness while perfectly accessing and directing their quirk. It was a terrifying fusion of support technology and, he suspected, a powerful brainwashing quirk. He looked up at the gray, artificial sky, at the silent, circling drones. They were still watching. Still recording. To them, to the conductor, this was just data. A successful test. He, Izuku Midoriya, was a data point. A variable that had just been successfully manipulated. He felt a profound sense of violation, deeper than any physical injury. The conductor hadn't just trapped his body, he had trapped his soul. He had created a scenario where Deku's only path to survival was to betray his own heroic code. He had forced him to become a participant in his twisted symphony, to play the violent notes he had written. The weight of his victory settled upon him, heavy as a shroud. He was alone in a dead city, kneeling over the unconscious body of a man he had been forced to defeat. His body was bruised, his spirit was shattered, and the first moral compromise, the first of how many, lay like a lead weight in his stomach. This wasn't a victory. It was a desecration. And as he stared at his own trembling, unwilling fist, he understood with horrifying clarity that the hero's crucible wasn't just designed to test his strength. It was designed to break his spirit. And it had just landed its first, devastating blow. The silence that followed the conductor's gleeful pronouncement was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Izuku Midoriya knelt in the dirt and grime, the world reduced to the still form of the hero he had just defeated and the echoing applause of their tormentor. The praise was a vile poison, seeping into the wound of his actions. He hadn't performed for a crowd. He had fought for his life, and, in doing so, had trampled on his own soul. His hands, still trembling, hovered over Manuel. He was alive. That was the one flickering candle of solace in a cavern of darkness. But he was also unconscious, vulnerable, and a prisoner just as much as Deku was. Leaving him here in the open was not an option. He was still a hero, and Manuel was still a person in need of help, regardless of what had just transpired. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like dragging broken glass into his lungs, Deku made a new decision. The fight was over, but his duty was not. He gently, carefully, slid his arms under Manuel's shoulders and knees. The hero was heavier than he looked, a solid mass of muscle. Deku grunted, his own bruised and aching body protesting as he lifted him. The familiar green lightning of One for All flickered to life, taking the strain, but he kept the output low, just enough to manage the weight. He scanned the ruined plaza, his eyes darting from one collapsed structure to another. He needed shelter. A place to hide. A place to think. A place to protect the man he had just harmed. His gaze settled on a row of shattered storefronts across the street. One of them, a former bookstore, had its windows blown out, but its entrance was partially shielded by a large, overturned delivery truck, creating a defensible alcove. It would have to do. He began the slow, arduous walk across the plaza, each step a conscious effort. He felt 1,000 unseen eyes on him from the drones above, judging, recording. He ignored them. His world had shrunk to this single, vital task, carrying his fallen opponent to safety. It was a penitence journey, a pilgrimage of guilt. As he reached the relative shadow of the truck, a sudden, sharp spike from danger sense made him freeze. It was different from the constant, agonizing static. This was new. Close. And it was observing him. Not one. Two. The feeling radiated from the darkened maw of the bookstore he had been heading towards. Two distinct sources of cautious, fearful intent. He slowly lowered Manuel to the ground, placing him gently behind the bulk of the truck, shielding him from view. He then straightened up, his body tensing, every muscle coiled and ready. The fight with Manuel had been brutal, but it had also reawakened his combat instincts. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a grim, weary readiness. "Come out," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. It carried in the dead air. "I know you're there." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a hesitant shuffle from within the shadows. A figure emerged slowly, hands raised in a gesture that was half surrender, half don't shoot. Deku's eyes widened slightly in recognition. The dark green combat suit, the square jaw, the short blonde hair. It was Koincidental Subiraba, from Class 1B. His hero name was Rule, but Deku couldn't think of him as anything other than a fellow student. He looked terrified. His face was pale, streaked with dirt, and his eyes were wide with a fear that Deku understood all too well. "Midoriya?" Subiraba's voice was a dry croak. Is that really you?" Before Deku could answer, a second figure stepped out from the bookstore, moving with a fluid confidence that was the complete opposite of Tsubiraba's nervous apprehension. This man was older, maybe in his mid to late 20s, with a lean, wiry build. His costume was a practical, heavily worn set of dark gray fatigues with burnt orange highlights, scuffed and patched in several places. A jagged, silvery scar cut from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling at the corner of his cynical-looking mouth. His dark, intelligent eyes weren't filled with fear, but with a sharp, assessing suspicion. He looked at Deku, then his gaze flickered to the spot behind the truck where Deku had laid Manuel. "So you're the one," the stranger said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "We saw the whole thing. The light show. The waterworks. The big finish. You took down a pro-hero like he was nothing." The words were not an accusation, they were a statement of fact, but they hit Deku with the force of a physical blow. He flinched, the guilt churning in his stomach. "It wasn't like that," Deku started, his voice cracking. He was being controlled. "There's a collar." "Save it," the man cut him off, taking a step forward. A small, intense flicker of orange flame danced to life around his gloved fist, casting dancing shadows on his scarred face. "I've heard 1,000 excuses for why things go bad. They never matter. All I see is one of UA's golden boys throwing around enough power to level a city block, and another hero down for the count. For all we know, you're just one of them. The next monster in the cage." Tsubiraba looked nervously between the two of them. "Burnout, wait. Stay back, kid," the man named Burnout snapped, his eyes never leaving Deku. "This one's in a different league. We need to know whose side he's on." The heat from his fist was a tangible thing, warping the air between them. Deku felt a flash of irritation, a defensive anger at being judged so quickly, but it was snuffed out just as fast by a wave of crushing exhaustion. He didn't have the energy for another fight, another confrontation. He just wanted this nightmare to end. Instead of powering up, he relaxed his stance. He held up his own empty hands, showing he meant no harm. "My name is Deku," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm a pro-hero. A few hours ago, I was abducted from my patrol and thrown in here. The man behind the truck is Manuel. He's a hero I respect. He was being controlled by a device on his neck, and he was ordered to kill me. I did what I had to do to survive. I didn't want to hurt him." His voice broke on the last few words. "He's alive. I checked. He's just unconscious." He looked past Burnout to Tsubiraba, his expression pleading for understanding. "Tsubiraba-kun, you know me. You know I would never." He couldn't finish the sentence. Tsubiraba chewed on his lip, his gaze flickering from Deku's earnest, desperate face to Burnout's hostile posture. He had seen the fight. He had seen the raw, terrifying power Deku had unleashed. But he had also seen Deku's hesitation. He had heard him screaming Manuel's name, begging him to stop. And now, he was seeing the aftermath, a so-called victor who looked more broken than the vanquished. "I believe him," Tsubiraba said, his voice gaining a sliver of confidence. "He's not one of them. I saw his face during the fight burn out. He was in agony." Burnout's flame didn't die down, but his stance lost some of its aggressive edge. His cynical eyes narrowed, studying Deku with a new intensity. He was looking for the lie, the weakness, the angle. What he saw was a teenager who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world, his shoulders slumped, his eyes haunted. He saw not a monster, but a kid who had been forced to do something terrible. It was a look he had seen in his own mirror many times. "Fine," Burnout grunted, the flame on his fist extinguishing with a soft hiss. "For now. But if you make one wrong move, Golden Boy, I'll turn you to charcoal. Got it?" Deku nodded, a wave of relief making him feel lightheaded. "Got it." He gestured towards the bookstore. "Is it safe in there?" "Safer than out here," Tsubiraba said, motioning for him to follow. "We cleared it out. There's a back room with no windows." Deku moved back to Manuel, lifting him again. Burnout watched him, his expression unreadable, before stepping forward. "Give him here," he said, the words coming out as a gruff command. "You look like you're about to fall over." Deku hesitated, instinctively protective. But he saw no malice in Burnout's eyes now, only a weary pragmatism. He was right. Deku's arms were shaking, and his vision was starting to blur at the edges from sheer physical and emotional exhaustion. He nodded and carefully transferred Manuel's weight. Burnout grunted under the load but squared his shoulders and carried the unconscious hero into the darkness of the bookstore with surprising ease. Deku and Subiraba followed him in. The interior of the store was a disaster zone. Bookshelves were overturned, their contents scattered across the floor in a sea of paper and dust. Moonlight, filtered through the sickly yellow barrier of the dome, streamed through the shattered windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It smelled of mildew, old paper, and decay. Burnout carried Manuel to a small, doorless room in the back, which must have been an employee office. He laid him down gently on a dusty, stained carpet. Deku immediately knelt beside him again, checking his pulse, his breathing. Both were still steady. The red light on the collar continued its erratic, aerostate blinking. The three of them stood in the cramped, dark room, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken questions. Subiraba broke it first. "How long have you been here, Midoriya?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. A few hours, maybe?" Deku replied, not looking up from Manuel. "I was on patrol, and then, gas. I woke up in a concrete box." A voice calling himself the conductor explained the rules. The hero's crucible, Burnout finished for him, his voice flat. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Yeah, we got the same welcome speech. I've been in this hellhole for almost 2 days. Subiraba here for about a day. 2 days. The thought made Deku's blood run cold. They had been surviving in this graveyard for 2 days. "Have you seen anyone else?" Deku asked. "Other contestants?" Subiraba shuddered, wrapping his arms around himself. "We've seen things. Fights. We saw a hero. I think it was that guy with the slug body, slide and go, get taken down by another hero. The one he was fighting, she was fast. Wore a horned mask. It was over in seconds. We've been hiding ever since." Burnout snorted, a bitter, humorless sound. "Hiding. That's all we've been doing. Watching from the sidelines while this sick bastard makes heroes tear each other apart for his entertainment. At least you fought back." There was a grudging respect in his tone that hadn't been there before. Deku finally looked up from Manuel, his eyes meeting Burnout's. "Who are you?" he asked, the question genuine. The man pushed himself off the doorframe. "The name's Kenji. Kenji Tanaka. Used to be a sidekick. Hero name was Burnout." He said the name with a self-deprecating sneer. Emphasis on the out. "I've never heard of you," Deku admitted, feeling a pang of guilt. He prided himself on his hero knowledge. Kenji let out a short, harsh laugh. "Doesn't surprise me. The commission scrubbed me pretty good. 5 years ago, I was a sidekick at Endeavor's agency. Hot stuff, literally. My quirk is pyrokinesis, but it's volatile. The more emotional I get, the hotter and more uncontrollable the flames become." He held up his scarred hand, staring at it as if it were a foreign object. "We were responding to a high-rise bank robbery. Villain had a gravity manipulation quirk, was dropping chunks of the building onto the street. I went in hot, trying to corner him. He panicked, reverse polarity, and sent a whole floor of office furniture flying at a group of civilians trapped on the street below. I panicked too. I unleashed everything I had to try and incinerate the debris before it hit them." He fell silent. The air in the room grew heavy. "I saved them," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But the resulting fireball, it flash ignited the whole street. Cars exploded. The building facade melted. Dozens of second and third-degree burns. I hurt more people than the villain did. The media called me a monster. The HPSC held a hearing and revoked my license. Declared my quirk unfit for heroic duties. And that was that." Burnout burned out. He looked at Deku, his cynical eyes holding a deep, ancient pain. "So don't look at me like I'm some hero, golden boy. I'm just a guy with a broken trigger who got famous for 1 day of spectacular failure." Deku stared at him, his heart aching with a sudden, profound empathy. He saw a man who had tried to do the right thing, who had made a split-second decision in an impossible situation, and had paid a terrible price for it. He was the dark reflection of what could have happened to Deku himself 100 times over, a reminder of the razor-thin edge all heroes walked. You saved those people from the falling debris, Deku said softly. That's what matters. Kenji looked away, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Tell that to the family of the kid who got put in a burn unit because of me. A fragile, somber understanding began to form in the small, dark room. The three of them were a microcosm of Hero Society's damaged state. Deku, the prodigy, the symbol of hope, now scarred by a morally compromising act. Tsuburaba, the student, the next generation, now paralyzed by fear and a sense of utter helplessness. And Kenji, the veteran, the outcast, consumed by a bitterness born from a system that had chewed him up and spat him out. They were a chorus of the damned, brought together in a madman's opera. So what's the plan? Tsuburaba asked, his voice pulling them back to the grim reality of their situation. We can't just hide in here forever. The conductor, he won't let us. Deku pushed himself to his feet, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of desperate resolve. Kenji's story, his own fight, it was all fuel. He couldn't let this place break anyone else. The plan is, we stick together, Deku said, his voice gaining a strength he didn't know he possessed. We're not just contestants. We're a team. You said it yourself, Kenji-san, you've been hiding. I've been fighting alone. Neither works. But together we have a chance. A chance to what? Kenji shot back, his cynicism returning. To die together? There are more of those puppet heroes out there. And God knows what else. We're outnumbered and outgunned in a cage the size of a city. We have my power, Deku said, letting a faint trace of green lightning crackle over his skin. We have your experience and firepower, he said, looking at Kenji. And we have your quirk for defense and control, he added, turning to Tsuburaba. You can create barriers, can't you? Solid air? Tsuburaba nodded, a flicker of his Yue confidence returning. Air prison. I can solidify the air I breathe to create walls or boxes. They're pretty tough. See? Deku insisted. Offense, defense, and strategy. We can cover each other's weaknesses. We find a better place to fortify, we gather supplies, water, food if there is any, and we figure out how to get these collars off. We don't just survive. We fight back. We liberate them. He gestured to Manuel. And we find this conductor, and we make him pay. It was a classic Deku speech, full of hope and impossible determination. In the bright halls of Yue, it would have been inspiring. Here, in the dusty ruins, surrounded by decay and despair, it felt dangerously naive. Kenji stared at him for a long moment, then let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. You really believe that, don't you? You really think you can play the hero in a place like this? I have to, Deku said simply. It's all I am. The quiet sincerity of his words seemed to finally break through Kenji's wall of cynicism. He didn't agree, not really, but he saw the unshakable conviction in the kid's eyes. It was a conviction he himself had once possessed, a lifetime ago. Fine, Kenji said, running a hand through his messy hair. Fine. We try it your way, golden boy. But the moment it goes south, it's every man for himself. Agreed? Agreed, Deku said, knowing it was the only concession he could get. Tsuburaba nodded eagerly, a desperate glimmer of hope in his eyes. For the first time since they had been thrown into this nightmare, they weren't just isolated, terrified individuals. They were a unit, a fragile, damaged, and deeply dysfunctional unit, but a unit nonetheless. A sense of purpose, however small, began to settle over Deku. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a leader. The burden of that title felt immense, another weight added to the guilt he already carried, but it was also an anchor. It gave him something to focus on beyond his own pain. He had to protect them. He had to get them out. Just as this fragile alliance was cemented, the conductor's voice returned, shattering the moment of grim resolve. It boomed into their small sanctuary, as if he had been listening, waiting for the perfect moment to interject. Ah, how touching! A little band of misfits. The fallen star, the frightened child, and their broken messiah. A truly pathetic yet compelling ensemble. The three of them tensed, their heads snapping up as if looking for the source of the voice. I grow tired of these solo performances and games of hide-and-seek, the conductor continued, his tone shifting from mockery to a cold, commanding authority. The composition requires more complexity, more harmony, more discord. So, let us change the tempo. A palpable sense of dread filled the room. This was it. The other shoe was dropping. Effective immediately, the parameters of the crucible have been updated. I call this next movement, the team scramble. Your nascent alliance will be put to the test against an established, and far more formidable, partnership. Deku's heart hammered against his ribs. A duo. Subiraba had said the other puppets were working in pairs. Your opponents are on their way to your location now. 2 more esteemed members of our fallen collection. A hero whose gaze can lock down reality itself, and another whose senses can pierce the very air you breathe. A wonderful combination of control and detection. Lock down reality? Deku's encyclopedic mind raced. There was only one hero he knew with a quirk like that. Rock Lock. Let's see how your little chorus of the damned fares against a truly dissonant duet, the conductor purred, the sadistic glee evident in his voice. Try to make it interesting. The overture is over. The real performance is about to begin. Good luck. The voice cut out, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than the announcement itself. They were no longer hiding. They were being hunted. Kenji swore, a string of creative curses, and immediately moved to the shattered window, peering out into the twilight. Subiraba looked at Deku, his face ashen, the newfound hope already draining from it. He knows where we are, Subiraba whispered, his voice trembling. He was watching us the whole time. Deku's mind was racing, kicking into strategic overdrive. Rock Lock. His quirk could freeze an object's position in space. He could lock doors, create impassable barriers, or worse, lock a person in place, making them a sitting duck. And his partner? Senses that can pierce the air? That sounded like a tracking quirk. They couldn't run, and they couldn't hide. They were trapped. And the hunters were coming. Deku looked at the terrified student and the bitter veteran who were now, inexplicably, his responsibility. He looked at the unconscious form of Manuel on the floor. The burden of leadership was no longer an abstract concept. It was a crushing, immediate reality. He had promised them a chance. Now, he had to deliver one. Get ready, Deku said, his voice low and deadly serious, the last traces of the frightened student replaced by the hardened resolve of a hero forged in a crucible. They're coming to us, so we won't be the ones who are hiding. The conductor's announcement hung in the air of the ruined bookstore like a death sentence. The fragile hope that had taken root just moments before was now strangled by a cold, immediate dread. They weren't just trapped in a cage. The zookeeper had just released 2 predators into their enclosure, and told them where to find their prey. Damn it! Kenji hissed, his body a tense line as he peered through a crack in the boarded-up storefront window. He was playing with us. Letting us form a little team just so he could watch it get torn apart. His cynicism had returned with a vengeance, a bitter armor against the encroaching fear. Subiraba was pacing in the cramped back room, his movements jerky and panicked. A duo? Rock Lock and a sensor type? We're finished. They'll find us, lock us down and... He couldn't bring himself to finish the thought, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Deku stood over Manuel's unconscious form, his mind a tempest of tactical calculations. The conductor's words replayed in his head, a hero whose gaze can lock down reality itself, and another whose senses can pierce the very air you breathe. Rock Lock's quirk, Lockdown, was terrifyingly effective. He could touch an object and fix its position in space relative to the ground, making it immovable. He could lock a door shut, freeze a projectile in midair, or immobilize a person with a single touch. And his partner, a sensor. It had to be the retired hero Sirius, whose quirk, Good Ear, allowed her to hear minuscule sounds through solid objects, making ambushes nearly impossible. She could hear their heartbeats, their breathing, from a block away. Running was pointless. Hiding was a temporary solution at best. They would be found. No, Deku said, his voice cutting through Subiraba's panicked muttering. It was quiet but held a core of steel that made both of them stop and look at him. We're not finished. We're not going to hide. He pushed himself to his feet and walked into the main room, his gaze sweeping over the chaotic landscape of overturned shelves and scattered books. This wasn't just a ruin, it was a battlefield they could shape. He wants a show, Deku said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. He's expecting us to panic, to scatter. He's expecting prey. We're not going to be prey. We're going to be the trap. Kenji turned from the window, a skeptical eyebrow raised. A trap? With what? Harsh language and teenage optimism? They're two professional heroes, Golden Boy. Even as puppets, their coordination will be flawless. Then we have to be better, Deku retorted, his mind working faster than it ever had before. He pointed to the massive, overturned metal bookshelves. Subirabu-kun, can your air prison lift things? Subiraba blinked, thrown by the sudden shift in questioning. Lift? No, not really. It creates a solid barrier of air. It can push things if I form it quickly, but it's not telekinesis. Good enough, Deku said, already moving on. He turned to Kenji. Your quirk, it's fire, right? How precise can you be? Can you create a flash, a wall of heat, without burning the whole place down? Kenji's cynical expression wavered, replaced by a flicker of grudging interest. My control is shot when I'm emotional. But when I'm cold? Yeah, I can be precise. I can create heat shields, concussive blasts of superheated air. Why? Because we're not fighting two opponents, Deku explained, a frantic energy building in him as the plan formed. We're fighting a system. Rock Lock immobilizes, Sirius detects. We can't let them work together. We have to separate them. Confuse them. Overwhelm their senses. He began to move through the bookstore, his hands gesturing as he laid out the battlefield. This is our kill box. But we're not trying to kill them. We're trying to disable them. We need to break those collars. He pointed to the main entrance. They'll come through there. That's the choke point. Kenji, I need you on that second-floor balcony. He indicated a collapsed mezzanine that overlooked the entrance. When they enter, you don't attack. You create a wall of intense heat between them. Not fire, just a shimmering thermal barrier. It will distort their vision, and more importantly, it should play hell with Sirius's hearing. Sound travels differently through air of different temperatures and densities. It will create acoustic distortion, like looking through a funhouse mirror with your ears. Kenji stared at him, a glimmer of shock in his eyes. He had only ever thought of his quirk as a destructive force. The idea of using it for sensory disruption was completely new. That might actually work. Subiraba, Deku continued, turning to the younger student. You'll be with me, behind this main counter. He pointed to a large, solid-looking checkout counter near the back. Your job is defense. When they're separated by the heat wall, Rock Lock will likely try to secure the area. He'll try to lock down the exits, maybe even try to lock us in place. Your job is to counter him. Can you create a barrier of air in front of something he's about to touch? I think so, Subiraba said, his panic beginning to recede, replaced by a focused concentration. If I can see him, I can project a small air prison. He'd touch my barrier instead of the object. Exactly. Deku's eyes were alight with fierce intelligence. You're our anti-lockdown. You run interference. Keep him from controlling the space. My job, he said, clenching his fists, is to be the distraction. I'll be the primary target. I'll draw Rock Lock's fire, keep him moving, keep him focused on me, while he's busy trying to pin me down, and Sirius is disoriented by the heat wall. One of you, Kenji, you'll have the better angle, needs to get a clear shot at the collar. We saw it with Manuel. A strong, focused blow can overload them. The plan was audacious, complex, and hinged on split-second timing. It was a desperate gamble, but it was infinitely better than cowering in a back room, waiting for the end. For the first time, a spark of something other than bitterness or fear ignited in his two companions. It was the faintest glimmer of a fighting chance. What about Manuel? Subiraba asked, looking towards the back room. He stays hidden, Deku said grimly. We can't risk him getting caught in the crossfire. We wall off that back room. Subiraba, can you make a solid air door? I can seal the whole doorway. It'll last as long as I can hold my breath and concentrate. Do it, Deku commanded. Then get into position. They'll be here any minute. The trio moved with a newfound purpose. Tsuburaba took a deep breath and pressed his hands against the frame of the office doorway. A translucent, shimmering barrier of solidified air flowed from his hands, sealing the room and protecting Manuel. He then scrambled behind a large counter, his face pale but his eyes determined. Kenji gave Deku a long, searching look. You're crazy, golden boy. You know that, right? We'll see if I'm right, Deku shot back. Kenji grunted, a sound that was almost a laugh, and with a surprising agility, leaped up, catching the edge of the broken mezzanine, and pulling himself onto the balcony. He found a spot in the shadows, crouched low, and gave Deku a sharp nod. Deku took his own position behind the counter next to Tsuburaba. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic hammering of his heart. He reached inward, to the quiet space where the vestiges of one for all resided. He didn't ask for power. He asked for clarity. Focus. 9th. The body is only as good as the mind that guides it. The voice of the second user was a cold, sharp anchor in the storm of his thoughts. A floorboard creaked outside the main entrance. Deku's head snapped up. Danger sense, which had been a dull thrum, spiked into a clean, sharp signal. They're here. He held up a single finger, signaling to the others. Tsuburaba nodded, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the counter. On the balcony above, Kenji went utterly still. The main doors of the bookstore, hanging askew on their hinges, were pushed open with a groan of tortured metal. Two figures stepped inside, silhouetted against the dying light. The first was unmistakably Rock Lock. His hero costume was the same, but like Manuel, his face was slack, his eyes vacant. The same metallic collar with its pulsing red light was wrapped around his neck. The second figure was a woman in a sleek, dark blue costume with silver accents. A helmet that resembled a stylized wolf's head, complete with pointed ears, covered her face. Serious. Her collar was partially hidden by her high-necked costume, but the faint, crimson glow was still visible. They stood just inside the doorway, a pair of deadly puppets. Sirius tilted her head, her helmet's ears twitching slightly as she scanned the silent, debris-strewn room. Rock Lock stood beside her, his hands held ready, his gaze empty but sweeping. Now, Deku whispered. From the balcony above, Kenji thrust his hands forward. There was no roar of flame, no explosion. Instead, the air in the center of the room, directly between Rock Lock and Sirius, began to shimmer and warp, like a mirage on a hot road. A perfect, invisible wall of superheated air snapped into existence. Sirius recoiled instantly, a hand flying to her helmet as if struck. The sudden, drastic change in air pressure and temperature had blasted her sensitive ears with a disorienting wave of sonic distortion. It was like a flash-bang grenade for her quirk. She stumbled back, shaking her head, temporarily deafened and confused. Rock Lock, unaffected, immediately identified the threat. His head snapped towards the balcony. He saw the faint outline of Kenji in the shadows. His hand shot out, his quirk activating. Lockdown, his own voice called out, flat and automated. He wasn't aiming for Kenji, but for the section of the balcony he was standing on. Tsuburaba! Deku yelled. Tsuburaba acted instantly. He slammed his palms onto the counter. Air prison! A cube of solid, translucent air materialized in front of the balcony, intercepting Rock Lock's touch. His fingers met the intangible barrier, his quirk failing to find a purchase on the physical structure. The balcony remained intact. Rock Lock's programming processed the failure and immediately reprioritized. The primary threat was the one who had just used the quirk. Tsuburaba. He lunged forward, moving with the explosive speed of a trained pro. He vaulted over a pile of books, his hand outstretched, aiming to lock Tsuburaba in place. My turn, Deku growled. He burst from behind the counter, a blur of green lightning, positioning himself directly in Rock Lock's path. Detroit smash. He threw a punch, but it wasn't a punch. At the last second, he opened his palm, unleashing a blast of focused air pressure, a miniature Delaware smash. He kept the power at a low 15%, just enough to create a concussive force. He wasn't aiming to injure, only to redirect. The air blast slammed into Rocklock's side. It wasn't enough to hurt him through his durable costume, but it was enough to throw off his balance. He staggered, his lunge diverted. He crashed into a massive steel bookshelf, the impact sending up a cloud of dust. The plan had worked. For now. Sirius was isolated and disoriented. Rocklock was separated from her and focused entirely on the new threats. Rocklock pushed himself off the bookshelf, his vacant eyes locking onto Deku. The machine had its target. He was a bull, and Deku had just waved the red flag. He charged. Deku met him head-on, not with force, but with agility. He used float to leap onto the side of another bookshelf, his iron saws clinging to the metal. Rocklock's hands swiped at the air where he had been, his lockdown quirk uselessly grabbing at nothing. "He's all yours, golden boy," Kenji yelled from above. "I've got to keep the listener busy." Deku glanced over. Sirius was recovering, shaking her head to clear it. She was trying to focus, to pinpoint their locations through the heat wall. Kenji, seeing this, sent another pulse of superheated air towards her, not to harm, but to keep her senses scrambled. She flinched back again, clearly frustrated. Deku turned his attention back to his own fight. Rocklock wasn't just trying to touch him. He was a seasoned veteran. He started using the environment, touching the floor, trying to lock down sections of it to trap Deku's feet. He grabbed loose books and debris, locking them in midair to create a hazardous maze of floating obstacles. "Tsuburaba, cover me!" Deku yelled, leaping from his perch. As Rocklock tried to lock a large chunk of fallen ceiling tile in Deku's path, a shimmering air prison wall appeared in front of it, blocking his touch. Tsuburaba was panting behind the counter, his face beaded with sweat, but he was doing it. He was effectively neutralizing Rocklock's greatest weapon. This freed Deku to go on the offensive. He zipped around the room, a green comet in the gloom. He used Black Whip, not to attack Rocklock, but to grab the floating, locked objects and swing them out of the way, clearing his path. "You're just a puppet!" Deku yelled, more to himself than to the empty shell of the hero. "You're predictable. You follow a program." He feinted left, then used FA Gene to store kinetic energy as he kicked off a wall, reversing his direction in a dizzying burst of speed. He appeared on Rocklock's right side, his fist crackling with green energy. He was close. Close enough to target the collar, but the puppet's programming had a contingency. It wasn't just Rocklock's skill, it was the conductor's strategy. As Deku closed in, Rocklock didn't try to counter. He dropped to one knee and slapped his palm flat against the floor. Lockdown, area expansion. His quirk radiated outwards from his hand. It wasn't a single-point lock, it was a wave. The entire floor in a 10-foot radius around him became an immovable, fixed point in space. Deku was inside that radius. His feet, clad in the iron soles, suddenly felt like they were encased in a block of concrete. His momentum vanished, his body lurching forward as his feet were instantly frozen in place. He was trapped. A perfect, stationary target. Rocklock rose to his feet, his hand extended, aiming for Deku's forehead. A single touch now would immobilize him completely. It was over. The trap had failed. "DKU!" Tsuburaba screamed. Behind the heat wall, Sirius's head snapped up. Even through the distortion, she had heard that. A clear, panicked voice. She now had a direction, but Kenji saw the danger. He couldn't attack Rocklock without risking hitting Deku. He couldn't reinforce the heat wall and deal with Sirius at the same time. He had to make a choice. He chose chaos. "Eat this, you tin-plated bastard!" he roared, leaping from the balcony. He landed on the floor between the heat wall and Rocklock's lockdown zone. He thrust his hands out, not towards an enemy, but towards the ceiling. Burnout burst. A massive, concussive blast of white-hot fire erupted upwards. It wasn't a sustained flame, but a single, violent explosion of thermal energy. It struck the already weakened ceiling, and the dilapidated structure gave way. Concrete, rebar, wiring, and dust rained down on the entire center of the room. The downpour of debris broke Rocklock's line of sight to Deku. It also forced Sirius, who was just beginning to advance, to shield herself. Most importantly, it shattered the area of the floor that Rocklock had locked down. The specific section of concrete Deku was standing on was now part of a collapsing ceiling, and the lockdown effect, tied to a non-existent point, broke. Deku's feet were free. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself backwards, out of the immediate danger zone, his mind reeling. Kenji's move was reckless, destructive, and it had just saved his life. "You crazy son of a," Deku started. "Less talking, more fighting." Kenji yelled back, landing in a crouch. The move had cost him. His breathing was heavy, and the skin around his gloved hands was flushed red. "That was half my reserves. I can't do it again." The dust began to settle. The situation had changed. The room was now a chaotic mess of fresh debris. Kenji was on the main floor, exposed. Subiroba was still pinned behind the counter, looking exhausted, and the two puppets were back on their feet. Worse, the heat wall had dissipated when Kenji used his big move. There was nothing separating their opponents anymore. Sirius and Rock Lock stood side by side amidst the rubble. The red lights on their collars pulsed in perfect, terrifying unison. They were a team again. "Okay," Deku breathed, his mind racing for a new plan. "Phase 2. Phase 2? Subiroba squeaked. "We didn't have a Phase 2. We do now," Deku said grimly. "Kenji-san, get back!" "Subiroba, on my signal, I need your biggest prison." "A full box." "Kenji, you're the trigger." Rock Lock and Sirius advanced together, a coordinated, silent death squad. Rock Lock took the lead, his hands ready to lock down anything that moved, while Sirius followed a half-step behind, her head tilted, her quirk now fully operational, mapping the room with sound. "They're coming," Kenji warned, backing away. "Wait for it," Deku said, his body coiling, green lightning crackling and condensing around him. He was gathering power, not for a single strike, but for sustained, high-speed movement. "Wait for it." They were 20 feet away. 15. "Now!" Deku roared. He exploded into motion. Manchester smash. He didn't aim at either of them. He brought his leg down in a devastating axe kick, slamming his iron soul into the rubble-strewn floor. The impact was immense. The floor buckled, sending a shockwave of debris and a massive cloud of dust billowing outwards, engulfing both Rock Lock and Sirius. It was a bigger, more powerful version of his smokescreen tactic with manual. "Subiroba! Air prison maximum!" Subiroba screamed, forcing the last of his energy into one final, desperate move. He thrust his hands forward, and a massive, shimmering box of solid air formed in the center of the room, right where Rock Lock and Sirius were, trapping them inside the dust cloud. "Kenji, now!" Deku yelled, his voice raw. Kenji didn't need to be told twice. He knew what he had to do. The box wouldn't hold two pro heroes for long. This was their one and only chance. He thrust his hand forward, not at the box, but inside it. A single, focused, lance of pure white flame, no thicker than his arm, shot through the translucent wall of the air prison. It was a level of precision he hadn't used in years. His target was not the heroes. It was the space between them. The lance of fire hit the dense cloud of pulverized concrete dust. The result was a fuel-air explosion. A muffled, brutal hump erupted from within the air prison. The box flashed a brilliant, blinding orange. It wasn't a sustained burn. It was a rapid, violent combustion of the dust particles, a contained detonation. The force of it made the air prison bulge outwards, stress fractures appearing on its surface. Subiroba cried out, blood trickling from his nose from the strain, but he held it together. Inside the box, the concussive force, amplified by the enclosed space, slammed into Rock Lock and Sirius. It was like being hit by a sledgehammer from every direction at once. They were thrown apart, crashing hard against the solid air walls of their cage. The air prison flickered and died. Subiroba collapsed behind the counter, utterly spent. The dust and smoke cleared. Rock Lock and Sirius lay on the floor, motionless, 10 feet apart. They were covered in soot, their costumes singed. Deku rushed forward, his heart in his throat. Kenji was right behind him, his face grim. Deku knelt beside Rock Lock. The hero was unconscious. Deku's eyes went straight to the collar. The metal was warped and blackened from the intense heat of the explosion. The red light was dead. With a soft crackle of fried electronics, a seam appeared on the collar, and it fell apart in 2 pieces, clattering to the floor. Kenji was checking on Sirius. "Same here," he grunted, prying the broken, smoking collar from her neck. "They're out cold, but they're breathing." They had done it. They had actually done it. Deku sat back on his heels, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its place. He looked at Kenji, whose face was a mask of shock and disbelief. He looked over at the counter, where Tsuburaba was slowly pushing himself up, looking dazed but alive. They had worked together. The cynical outcast, the terrified student, and the guilt-ridden prodigy. They had faced 2 elite pro-heroes, brainwashed and weaponized, and they had won. Not through overwhelming power, but through strategy, trust, and a desperate, shared will to survive. Kenji let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He stared at his hand, the one that had unleashed the final, decisive blast. I controlled it," he whispered, a look of utter astonishment on his face. "Even with all that, I controlled it." He had used his volatile, destructive power not as a blunt instrument, but as a surgical tool. He had done it to save them. In the heart of this twisted crucible, Kenji Tanaka had just performed his first truly heroic act in 5 years. Deku managed a weak, tired smile. "That was amazing, Kenji-san." The victory, unlike the one against Manuel, did not feel hollow. It felt earned. It felt real. It was a victory not just over their opponents, but over their own despair. But the moment of triumph was fleeting. The reality of their situation remained. They were still trapped. There were more puppets out there. And the conductor was still watching. Still, something had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just a chorus of the damned. They were a team. A scarred, battered, and unlikely team, but a team that had just proven it could fight back. Deku looked at the 2 new unconscious heroes on the floor. Their ranks were growing. But so were the stakes. This victory wasn't an ending. It was just a brief, defiant crescendo in the middle of a deeply dissonant and deadly duet. And the next movement was yet to come. The aftermath of the explosion was a world of ringing airs and drifting dust. The air, thick with the smell of ozone, burnt concrete, and Kenji's spent power, was a physical presence in the ruined bookstore. For a long, breathless moment, the only movement was the slow settling of debris and the heaving chests of the 3 survivors. They had won. The word felt fragile, unreal. Kenji stood over the unconscious form of Sirius, the 2 halves of her broken collar lying at his feet like a discarded shackle. He stared at his own hands, not with the usual bitterness, but with a dawning, fearful wonder. He had been so sure that any use of his quirk under pressure would result in disaster, a repeat of the incident that had ruined his life. Yet, in the crucible, he had found control. The fire that had once been his curse had become their salvation. Tsuburaba, leaning heavily against the counter, wiped a smear of blood from under his nose. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his eyes, wide and staring, held a new light. It was the terrified awe of a soldier who had survived his first true battle and couldn't quite believe he was still standing. And then there was Deku. He knelt between the still forms of Rock-Lock and Sirius, his adrenaline abandoning him like a retreating tide, leaving behind a landscape of deep, aching bruises and a soul-crushing weariness that went far beyond the physical. His mind, which had been a razor-sharp weapon of strategy and instinct just moments ago, felt frayed and dull. The desperate victory had been a shared one, and it didn't carry the solitary, acidic guilt of his fight with Manuel. But it was a victory born of violence and desperation all the same. Another brutal note in the conductor's symphony. We did it," Tsuburaba stammered, his voice cracking. "Yeah," Kenji breathed out, his voice rough. He looked at Deku. "Your plan, Golden Boy. It was insane. And it actually worked." Deku didn't respond. He was methodically checking the conditions of Rock-Lock and Sirius, just as he had with Manuel. Their breathing was steady, their pulses strong. They were deeply unconscious, victims of the concussive blast, but they were alive. 3 for 3. They had saved 3 heroes from their puppet strings. But the cost was piling up. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see Kenji standing over him, his cynical mask firmly back in place, though his eyes held a new, uncertain depth. We can't stay here, Kenji said, his voice low. The conductor saw that. He knows what we can do now. The next contestants he sends won't be a test. They'll be an execution squad. We need a better fortress. Deku knew he was right. They had made too much noise, created too much chaos. This bookstore was a compromised position. The subway, Subiraba suggested, his voice gaining a little strength. When we were hiding, we found a service entrance to the subway tunnels about 3 blocks from here. It's deep underground. The drones won't be able to follow us. It's a labyrinth down there. We could get lost, but so could they. It was the most logical move. Underground, they would be shielded from the constant, oppressive surveillance. They could rest, regroup, and figure out their next move away from the conductor's immediate gaze. Okay, Deku said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. Okay. The subway. But we can't leave them. He gestured to the 3 unconscious heroes, Manuel, still sealed in the back room, and Rock and Sirius. We take them with us. Kenji stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. Are you crazy? We can barely carry ourselves. Hauling 3 dead weights through 3 blocks of hostile territory? It's suicide. We are not leaving them behind, Deku stated, a sudden, fierce energy cutting through his exhaustion. It wasn't negotiable. It was the one pure, unshakable tenet he had left to cling to in this moral wasteland. They are heroes. They are victims. We protect them. That's the mission now. Not just survival. Rescue. The conviction in his voice was absolute. It was the core of Izuku Midoriya, burning through the grime and the guilt. Kenji saw it, and for the second time that day, he found himself yielding to the kid's impossible, infuriating idealism. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of resignation. Fine, he grunted. Fine. But you're carrying 2 of them, golden boy. My arms feel like overcooked noodles. The journey to the subway entrance was a slow, agonizing ordeal. Subiraba, having recovered slightly, used his air prison quirk to create a floating platform, a solid slab of air that he could painstakingly push forward. It was slow and draining, but it allowed them to place Manuel and Sirius on it. Deku, his own body screaming in protest, lifted Rock in a fireman's carry. Kenji, his quirk completely depleted, took point, his sharp eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of movement, a pistol he'd scavenged from a police car clutched in his hand. They moved through the skeletal remains of the city like ghosts, a small, shuffling procession of the wounded and the weary. The drones circled high above, their red lights like distant, malevolent stars, but they didn't attack. It seemed the conductor was content to simply watch them, to let them exhaust themselves further. By the time they reached the graffitied, grime-covered service hatch Subiraba had found, they were all at the breaking point. Kenji pried open the heavy iron lid, revealing a flight of steep, rusted stairs descending into pitch darkness. The air that wafted up smelled of damp earth, stagnant water, and cold stone. It took them another 20 minutes to maneuver the unconscious heroes down the treacherous steps and into the tunnel below. When the last of them was safely inside, Kenji slammed the heavy lid shut, plunging them into absolute, disorienting blackness. The sudden cutoff from the sickly yellow sky of the arena was a shock to the system. The oppressive silence of the city above was replaced by a new kind of quiet, punctuated by the drip of water from the ceiling and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Light, Subiraba whispered, his voice trembling in the dark. A small, intense orange flame bloomed in Kenji's palm. It wasn't the violent fire of his quirk, but a tiny, controlled flicker from a cheap lighter he kept in his pocket. The warm light pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing a narrow service tunnel, its concrete walls slick with moisture and covered in moss. They were safe. For the moment, they found a larger junction room a short way down the tunnel, a place where several passages converged. It was dry, and a broken maintenance bench provided a place to rest. They carefully laid out the 3 unconscious heroes, using their own discarded hero jackets as makeshift pillows. The moment the task was done, the last of Deku's strength gave out. His legs buckled, and he slid down the grimy wall to the floor, his head thudding against the concrete. His body felt like a massive, singular bruise. The adrenaline that had carried him through 2 brutal fights and a desperate trek was gone, and the pain, both physical and psychological, came rushing in to fill the void. He closed his eyes. The faces of his opponents flashed behind his eyelids. Manuel's blank stare. Rocklock's determined, empty charge. The brief, agonizing moment when he had made the choice to strike down a fellow hero. The thunderous, contained explosion Kenji had created. Did I do the right thing? The question was a venomous whisper in his mind. He had saved himself, saved his new allies. He had freed the heroes from their control, but he had used violence, trickery, and brute force to do it. He had met the crucible on its own terms. Had he truly won, or had he just become the monster the conductor wanted him to be? Get some rest, kid, Kenji's voice rumbled from nearby. You earned it. I'll take the first watch. Deku gave a slight nod, too exhausted to speak. He curled up on the cold floor, his body craving the oblivion of sleep. But his mind wouldn't quiet down. It was a chaotic storm of guilt, fear, and self-doubt. The faces kept flashing. The choices kept replaying. His breathing deepened. The darkness of the tunnel began to merge with the darkness behind his eyes. He wasn't just falling asleep. He was falling inward, his consciousness sinking away from the physical world, drawn down into the deep, shared well of one for all. He was floating in a void. It was not the cold, damp blackness of the subway tunnel. This was a different kind of darkness, a vast, starless space that was not empty, but full. It thrummed with a silent, immense power, the raw, untamed energy of one for all. Wisps of green and gold lightning drifted past him like ethereal nebulae. This was the sanctum. The heart of his quirk. He was not alone. 8 figures stood before him, their forms composed of the same shimmering, energetic light as their surroundings. The vestiges. His predecessors. They were more solid, more defined than he had ever seen them before. The stress of the crucible, the constant, high-stakes use of his quirk, had forged a stronger, clearer connection. He could see their faces, their expressions, with perfect clarity. Yoichi Shigaraki, the first, stood at the forefront, his expression gentle but etched with a deep, sorrowful empathy. Beside him, the second and third users, grim and silent as ever, watched him with their hard, pragmatic eyes. Heikid Shinomori, the fourth, looked pale and concerned, the black cracks on his face seeming more pronounced. Daigoro Banjo, the fifth, had his arms crossed, a look of frustrated energy on his boisterous face. And the sixth was a shrouded, quiet presence, observing him intently. But it was Nana Shimura, the seventh, who stepped forward first. Her form blazed with a fierce, protective light. Her expression was not one of comfort, but of pure, unadulterated fury. That monster! She seethed, her voice echoing in the void. It was not directed at Deku, but at an unseen enemy. That vile creature, to take heroes, good people who have dedicated their lives to others, and turn them into puppets, to defile their honor, their legacy. It is unforgivable. Her anger was a palpable force, a righteous inferno that washed over Deku. It was the same fury he felt, but amplified, purified. He had been so consumed by his own guilt that he had forgotten the sheer, objective evil of what was being done to them. Daigoro Banjo slammed a fist into his ethereal palm. She's right. If I could get my hands on this conductor, I'd wrap him up so tight in black whip he'd pop like a grape. His bravado was a welcome, if jarring, contrast to the somber mood. Rage will not solve this, a cold voice cut in. It was the second user. His arms were crossed, his gaze sharp and analytical as it fixed on Deku. Your anger is justified, ninth, but it is a tool, not a solution. You let your sentimentality rule you in the first fight. You almost died. The words were blunt, harsh, but they weren't cruel. It was the brutal honesty of a soldier who knew the cost of a single mistake. You held back against the water user, the third user added, his voice a low growl. You sought to preserve an ideal at the cost of your own life. Ideals do not matter if you are dead. Survival is the foundation upon which all else is built. You learned that. The second fight was better. You used your allies. You used the environment. You used deception. That is the path to victory here. Their words were a cold splash of water, washing away some of the emotional fog. They were right. His hesitation with Manuel had been a critical error. His strategy against Rock, Locke, and Sirius had been born from that near-fatal mistake. He was learning, but the lessons were written in blood and bruises. But I had to hurt them, Deku whispered, the guilt resurfacing, a heavy weight even in this immaterial realm. I raised my fist to a hero. I used my power, the power you all gave me, to bring them down. How can that be right? It was Yoichi who answered. He glided forward, his presence calming, like a gentle hand on a fevered brow. He looked at Deku. His eyes, so much like his brother's but filled with light instead of hatred, were full of a profound understanding. Izuku Midoriya, he said, his voice soft but resonant. Look at me. What do you see? Deku looked at the first user. I see the beginning. The one who defied his brother. You see a man who was weak, Yoichi corrected gently. I had a useless quirk. I was sickly. My brother, all for one, could have crushed me with a thought. He was more powerful in every conceivable way, and yet I resisted. Not with strength, but with will. But my will alone was not enough. I would have died in that vault, a forgotten spark of defiance. He gestured to the second and third users. They saved me. But they did not save me with kind words or noble ideals. They saved me with violence. They fought. They killed. They did what was necessary to combat a monster who sought to control everything. He then turned his gaze back to Deku. This conductor, he is a reflection of my brother. All for one sought to control people by stealing and granting quirks, making them dependent on him, turning them into his tools. This conductor controls people through technology and coercion, turning them into his puppets. The method is different, but the core evil is the same, the utter subjugation of the human will. Yoichi's form seemed to glow brighter. You are not fighting heroes, Izuku. You are fighting the extension of the conductor's will. You are fighting the cage, not the birds trapped within. Your fight with Manuel was not a failure of your ideals. It was your first lesson in understanding the nature of this new enemy. You did not strike down a hero. You broke a single bar on their cage. The perspective shifted in Deku's mind. The guilt didn't vanish, but it was reshaped. He hadn't attacked Manuel. He had attacked the system controlling him. His fist had not been aimed at a man, but at a mechanism of control. It was a subtle distinction, but in the depths of his soul, it meant everything. Your compassion is not a weakness, Ninth, Nana Shimura said, her voice softer now, her fury banked into a steady, determined flame. It is your greatest strength. It is the core of One for All. It is why you were chosen. A lesser man, a more pragmatic man, might see the puppets as acceptable losses. They might choose to kill them to survive. You chose a harder path. You chose to save them, even at great risk to yourself. Do not ever lose that. That is what makes you a hero. That is what makes you our hero. A warmth spread through Deku's chest, a profound sense of validation and acceptance. The weight on his soul lessened, replaced by a renewed, hardened resolve. But compassion alone is not enough, Nana continued, her expression turning serious. Tashinori learned that. I learned that. To save everyone, you must be strong enough, and smart enough, to defeat those who would harm them. You need to be more than just a symbol. You need to be a soldier. And, the sixth user, who had been silent until now, drifted forward, his shrouded form parting slightly. The collars, he said, his voice a smoky whisper. You are focused on the fighters, but the true enemy is the technology. You have been treating it as a lock that requires a key of brute force. Deku focused, recalling the image of the collars with perfect clarity. The seamless gray metal. The single pulsing light. The way they broke apart after a sufficient, violent impact. In my time, and continued, we faced enemies who used support gear to augment their quirks. We learned that every machine has a flaw. A seam. A vulnerability. You are looking at the collars as armor to be broken. Look at them as a system to be dismantled. With a gesture from En, a perfect, ethereal replica of the collar materialized in the void before Deku. It pulsed with the same malevolent red light. You have analyzed it with your eyes and said? Now analyze it with One for All. Feel its energy. Find its seams. Deku reached out, his own ethereal hand passing through the image of the collar. He didn't just look at it, He focused all his senses, all the latent energy of his quirk, upon it. He let the data stream into him. He felt the low-level energy signature that powered it. He sensed the microcircuitry woven into the alloy. He could feel the faint signal it was constantly receiving from the conductor's network, the stream of commands that dictated the puppet's actions. And then he found it. It was a tiny imperfection. A knot in the energy grid. A single point, no larger than a pinhead, where the power distribution was focused. It was the receiver, the point where the brainwashing quirk's influence and the technological commands were translated into nerve impulses. It was the linchpin of the entire device. The receiver, Deku whispered in awe. It's the weak point. It's unshielded. A powerful enough impact, like the explosion, can overload the whole system and break it, the second user confirmed. But that is inefficient. It requires too much energy and causes too much collateral damage to the wearer. A precise strike, a focused burst of energy aimed directly at that receiver. It should theoretically short-circuit the command module without needing to destroy the entire collar. It could disable the puppet instantly, Deku realized, his mind racing with the possibilities. It wouldn't require a knockout blow. A precise, high-frequency vibration, a targeted electrical pulse, or even, his eyes widened. He looked at the second user. Your quirk. Gearshift. If I can touch the collar, can I use gearshift to rapidly accelerate and decelerate the receiver's internal components? I could shake it apart from the inside out. The second user gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was the most expressive approval Deku had ever received from him. The theory is sound, but it would require a level of precision and control you have not yet demonstrated. You would need to be within inches, touching the device, likely while the wearer is actively trying to kill you. It's a third option, Deku breathed, the words filled with a dawning, brilliant hope. It was the answer he had been desperately searching for, not just a choice between his own survival and his ideals, but a path that united them. A way to save the heroes without having to defeat them in a brutal fight. A way to truly, finally, turn the tables on the conductor. His time in the void was coming to an end. The forms of the vestiges began to flicker, the darkness around him lightening, the sounds of the subway tunnel, the dripping water, Kenji's soft footsteps as he patrolled, filtering back in. Go, Ninth, Yoichi said, his voice a fading, encouraging echo. You are not just a contestant. You are not just a survivor. You are the inheritor of our will. This crucible was meant to break you, to reforge you into a weapon of their design. Show them what a hero truly is. Not a thing of power, but a beacon of hope. Not a warrior, but a liberator. Nana Shimura gave him one last, brilliant, determined smile. Make us proud, Izuku. His eyes snapped open. He was back. Lying on the cold concrete floor of the subway junction. The single flame from Kenji's lighter cast long, dancing shadows on the damp walls. His body still ached, but the crushing weight on his spirit had been lifted, replaced by a sharp, clear, and unwavering purpose. He sat up, his movements sudden and decisive. Kenji, who was leaning against the far wall, startled. Whoa, take it easy, golden boy. You were out cold. Thought we'd lost you to dreamland. Deku looked at his own hands. They were no longer the unwilling fists of a compromised survivor. They were the hands of a rescuer, armed with a new and powerful knowledge. I'm fine, Deku said, his voice clear and stronger than it had been since he'd arrived in this hell. I'm more than fine. He looked at the three unconscious heroes, their chests rising and falling in the dim light. He looked at Suburaba, sleeping fitfully nearby. He looked at Kenji, the weary, cynical man who had, against all odds, chosen to trust him. He was not alone. And he finally had a plan. Not just to survive the next fight, but to win the war. Kenji-san, Deku said, his eyes locking with the older man's. How long until they're awake? He gestured to Rock-Lock and Sirius. Hard to say, Kenji replied, shrugging. Concussion's a tricky thing. Could be hours. Could be days. Why? Because when they wake up, Deku said, a dangerous, determined smile touching his lips for the first time, we're going to have a lot to talk about. The days of us hiding are over. It's time we started hunting.